On June 6, 1996, a woman named Darlie Routier called 911 screaming that she and her sons had been stabbed. When emergency workers arrived on scene, 6-year-old Devin Routier was already deceased from 2 deep wounds to his chest. 5-year-old Damon Routier had 4 wounds to his back and was unresponsive. We've been through part 1, dealing the lead up to the trial, including Darlie's arrest. Welcome to part 2, where we will discuss the trial and the conviction of Darlie Routier. This case incites a lot of emotion from a lot of people, so get ready to have all those feelings bubble back to the surface. My name is Misty Sims, and this is Beyond Reasonable Doubt. Let's dive right in. Now, before we dive in, if you've not listened to part 1, please find the link in the description box and hear all the details of how we got to trial. And I apologize for the long delay in part 2 and for several graphics not being included due to it being just a little bit too much for YouTube, although a quick Google search and you can find any that I reference here. All right, now let's go through this tumultuous, twisting and turning trial. When we left part 1, Darlie had been arrested on June 18th and charged with 2 counts of capital murder. The police department released a statement saying they did not believe that Darren Routier was involved and that the crime scene told a story that was very different than the statements that Darlie had given. And Darlie's trial began on January 6, 1997 in Kerrville, Texas, and was for the charge of unaliving a child under 6. So only 1 death, as the prosecution said they believed it would be easier to win than in a case where they were trying to incur the burden of proof of 2. So the prosecution suggested that Darlie had killed her sons because of the family's financial difficulties. If you recall, we had discussed the potential foreclosure of their home, loans being denied, and her attempting to sell her friend Barbara's mother, Helena, who was also the housekeeper, several thousands of dollars worth of jewelry. Now, the prosecution really laid into their theory of this financial motive for the murders since both boys had life insurance policies on them. The defense argued that this only amounted to $10,000 total, which, according to them, wasn't even enough to cover the funeral expenses. The defense further argued that if she was willing to take the life of her children for money, why wouldn't she just take her husband instead? Because Darren had an $800,000 life insurance policy. And of course, the defense also raised the question that I think is in a lot of people's mind was, why did she leave 7-month-old baby Drake alive and unharmed if the motive was to protect and preserve some type of, affluent lifestyle or, just happy-go-lucky lifestyle? Well, the prosecution, they would describe her as a very self-centered and materialistic woman who was indeed cold enough to murder her own 2 children. Now, jurors also got to see that infamous silly string video that we discussed in part 1. Now, the interesting part about this video was there was much more video than was shown in court. The defense was in possession of that tape, and they chose not to air that footage in the courtroom, which I find a little odd because, it would have worked, I think, on behalf of Darlie's defense. But whatever reason, they chose not to air it. But we should note that jurors, after, while they're deliberating, they did request it, and they did watch that video repeatedly. Now, prosecution, they also brought up a neighbor to testify about a very ornate fountain that was in the Routier yard that friends and family had begun to decorate with various items like teddy bears and wreaths and things in memoriam of the boys. This neighbor, Nelda Watts, testified that she was headed to her mailbox and heard laughter, almost childlike. She went inside and looked out her window, and she could see Darlie and Darren tossing stuffed animals around and playing a game that's now been coined teddy bear basketball. Now, Darren refuted this, saying that it was Darlie's sister, Dana, and the defense did what they could to try to discredit Miss Watts due to her potentially having deteriorating eyesight, as she wasn't a young woman. She was actually a retired school teacher, been in the classroom for 34 years. And the prosecution also brought up crime scene consultant James Cron, who we discussed in part 1, and he testified that evidence suggested that the scene inside the Routier home had been staged, including a wine glass from the wine rack that had been broken, but after the crime was committed because there was no blood on it, even though it was laying on top of a bloodied area on the floor. The infamous 911 call was also played, and while it's been heavily disputed, the dispatcher backed up the odd behavior being exhibited about Darlie, about those fingerprints on the knife. First responders, including Officer Waddell, also testified about odd behavior at the scene, including him asking her to hold a towel and apply pressure to her son, and she never did. She just held the towel to her own neck. Now, there was testimony around items in the arrest warrant, such as blood in the sink that appeared someone had tried to clean up the scene, very graphic details about the boy's injuries, and then sightings of the hospital physician who thought her wounds were self-inflicted. On the flip, San Antonio Chief Medical Examiner testified that Darlie's wounds were only 2 millimeters from her carotid artery, and those were not conducive with self-inflicted wounds that he has seen in the past. So differing physicians' statements here. An additional piece of damning evidence, though, came from blood spatter expert Tom Bevel, who described 5 cast-off blood spatters on the back of Darlie's nightshirt. All contained blood of her as well as Damon and Devin, with the exception of one that was only Devin's on the back right shoulder. Bevel said the pattern and position indicated that she had raised the knife over her head as she withdrew it from each boy to then attack again. And that was how the cast-off ended up on her shirt. There were also 3 carpet fibers found on the nightshirt close to where the cuts in the shirt were, which were on the right shoulder. Yet she has no injuries on that side. Her cuts were to her left shoulder. Now, expert Charles Lynch testified that it was within his opinion that these defects to the shirt were self-inflicted. Because, again, in his opinion, you would have to hold some tension to the shirt and then make jabs with a weapon to create those type of cuts. And that wasn't something that could easily happen. And he also believed those holes were made, and then Devin was attacked after those holes were made. Now, the defense would argue that spatter on her shirt was from her having to help the boys, but no one witnessed this help, of course. And the spatter wasn't like a soak or a transfer stain; it was indeed spatter. Now, obviously, she could have rendered aid prior to any witness arriving, so that shirt has been heavily debated and is due to be retested actually once again. Another highly discussed piece of evidence was the blood trail in the house. The prosecution argued that it showed Damon was indeed moved from the point of attack to the point where he was found face down by the stairs. There was a handprint on the couch in Damon's blood and on the carpet, and it was only visible once luminol had been sprayed. These, along with the abrasions on the body, made it a theory that he had tried to crawl after the attack. Now, Darren's story changed around this. He testified that he didn't move Damon, he did move Damon, which was different than his original statements where he said he didn't because he was afraid he would injure him. At trial, he said he actually did move him closer to the wall and then pulled up his shirt to kind of take a look at his injuries. Well, another big deal about this blood trail was you heard me mention about the blood at the kitchen sink in the arrest warrant. There were also bloody fingerprints in front of the sink, drops of blood on the floor below, the counter's edge, and then like a smear on the cabinet door, all matching Darlie. Now, the blood in the sink, that wasn't visible until they sprayed the luminol. Again, Charles Lynch, who's a trace evidence expert, testified that the sink had diluted blood as though it had been washed away. But those drops on the sink and the counter were not diluted, and they were indeed Darlie's. So the prosecution theorized that this is where she inflicted her neck wound and then attempted to clean up. There was also blood on the backsplash that was a mixture of Damon and Devin's, which led prosecution to yet another theory that the boys were attacked, the knife was cleaned, and then they were attacked again. Now, I've talked a lot about Damon, but not so much about Devin. Devin never moved because he passed right where he was attacked. So that explains why we don't see quite the same trail with Damon, who we know was he either moved or was moved. Now, Darlie was represented by her lawyer, Doug Mulder. The defense attorney team said that she had absolutely no reason to have killed her children, and that the case didn't show motive, there was no confession, there were no witnesses, and it was just flat out unrealistic to accuse Routier of staging like this horrific crime scene. Well, one crucial piece of evidence that they brought up was a bloody sock found outside Darlie's home. While the police contended that this was merely a ruse, kind of designed to falsely implicate an intruder that had fled the scene, the defense said that they could basically prove that Darlie didn't commit the crime with this sock. Now, the distance from the house is some contention. I've read it was closer to 100 yards, closer to 75, so research that for yourself. But regardless, the sock looked to have had blood on it, so it was taken into evidence. There were trace amounts of Darlie and Darren's DNA because it was Darren's sock, and it did have blood on it from Damon and Devin. The defense argued that it was dropped by the killer on his way out. Now, there are a lot of people that believe Darlie planted this sock, okay? And while plausible that she could have run out there and run back quickly, and two pieces of evidence used to argue both for and against this theory is the timeline we got from Darlie and the motion sensor light. If the intruder left when Darlie said and went out the back of the house, there was a motion sensor light that would have tripped and it would have stayed on for 18 minutes. Once the 911 call was placed, police were on scene within 3 minutes. There was no light on. Investigators tried to go out of the home without triggering that light, and they found it impossible. So the timeline didn't quite make sense, or the way of exit didn't make sense. One of the two, right? Well, prosecutors theorized that she could have used the sock like as a glove, as her DNA was found on the inside toe of the sock, and ran out to plant it. That theory works, in thinking if she saw Damon was still alive, she could have come in after that and finished him off. That would have allowed time for that light to go off. Now, the defense team argues against her planting the sock. They said Damon was actually still alive, and you heard me say he was unresponsive when paramedics arrived on scene. And the medical examiner testified that he could have only survived approximately 8 minutes after receiving that injury. Darlie was on the phone with 911 for almost 6. The defense argued that this did not leave enough time for Darlie to hurt herself, stage a crime scene, plant a sock, and then return back before paramedics did. Which, quite plausible. They also stated that despite her injuries, Darlie's blood was not found anywhere in the garage nor outside the home. So the garage was where she said the intruder exited from. There were other pieces of evidence and testimony that you heard all throughout part 1. A lot of it was key testimony. There is a lot of evidence disputed, including the spatter and such, and I'll let you research further and form your own opinion there. But on February 1st, Darlie was convicted by a jury of capital murder of a child under 6 for the murder of Damon. She sobbed, saying she did not kill her babies, and a female relative of hers screamed at prosecutor Greg Davis outside the courtroom that he was the killer, and he would burn for this. So you can see that there was just a lot of emotion. It's very volatile. And on February 4th, she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Now, there have been a lot of appeals that have been denied. In 2018, though, there has been a move to retest DNA on several points of the case, with advancements, now in DNA testing. If it has been retested already, I couldn't find the results, just that it was still undergoing. So Darlie, just like us, she's sitting on death row waiting for some answers, and, her execution date has yet to be set. She and Darren did divorce in June of 2011, stating it was just, easier because their relationship was in complete limbo, but it was mutual that they would divorce. He's remained constant in saying that she was innocent, and her son, Drake, who's now an adult, still visits his mom, and he retains her innocence as well. Now, there's tons of books, television articles, and other publications that you can read on this case, and I highly encourage you to do so to help you decide what you think and how you feel about the trial and the conviction. Listen to the 911 call for yourself. Watch the videos. It's going to infuriate you regardless of which side you find yourself on, but I probably didn't do it justice here as much as you will do by just truly reading through testimony, arrest warrants, and things by yourself, because quite frankly, it's a lot, and it's going to really take you going through it to, I think, see how you feel and form an opinion on her guilt or innocence. This is a very hard story to hear, regardless of how you feel, because you're thinking about these two sweet boys whose lives were completely stolen from them, and that cuts me to my soul personally. I'm interested to see what comes out of the DNA retesting and how people feel after that. And I think I said it in part 1, and I will say it again. I do think Darren is just kind of a jerk and a poor husband based on the testimony of many others and self-admitted things that he's said and ways he treated Darlie routinely. You don't speak to your significant other that way. And I'm not blaming him for anything in this case, but I will blame him for acting in a very unbecoming way to his wife and setting a poor example to his children of how you speak to your partner that you're supposed to love. So that said, there's Darlie, guys. Controversial as ever. That's going to do it for me. As always, thank you guys for being here. Don't forget to click the subscribe button on the way out and that notification bell so that you know when I post new content. And you guys stay safe out there and stay sweet, my cupcakes. I love you, and I will see you next time.